Georgia O'Keeffe's Jack in the Pulpit #4 is one of her most controversial works, and I'm going to talk about why it's not a feminist work and whether that matters. Uh, this painting was hung in my living room growing up, so when we had to pick a piece to do a little bit of a deep dive on, I thought this would be perfect for it. Georgia O'Keeffe is unique to the Madison area because she was born here in Sun Prairie on a farm. She did not spend a lot of time here, however, once she grew up and moved on, made it to the big leagues. She studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Art Students League in New York, where she studied academic realism. After her time studying art, she filled various instructor roles in a couple parts of the country. During this time, she moved on from the teachings that she had in college and kind of left realism in the dust to pursue abstraction, which is where she made her big break. Her charcoal drawings got the attention of Alfred Stieglitz, who we learned about as one of America's greatest photographers or most influential. Alfred Stieglitz helped bring Georgia O'Keeffe to the world stage by providing her with a platform for her art. He had a gallery in New York City where he featured her works. Um, Also at this time, she became the subject of many of his photographs, as you see here, and they eventually got married. Um, their marriage had its ups and downs, um, possibly contributing to some of the mental health struggles that Georgia O'Keeffe faced in the 1930s. But uh, she recovered from those and she went on to continue creating art. Stieglitz died in 1946, and after that time, um, Georgia O'Keeffe moved to New Mexico, where she would spend the remainder of her life. The Jack in the Pulpit series was created by Georgia O'Keeffe in 1930. It's a group of paintings, 6 paintings, depicting its namesake from various angles and from various distances. She chose to depict them in an abstract way, showing perspectives that you typically wouldn't see of flowers. The theory behind the scale of these drawings was that she made them big enough, nobody would ignore them. And she was correct, because these paintings became her most popular and most famous paintings. So, like I said, I was focusing on Jack in the Pulpit #4 because this is the painting that I kind of grew up seeing in my childhood home. It has a vertical composition that I'm pointing out here, um, and you can see that she uses a lot of deep blue colors, a lot of deep greens, which is actually what she intended the focus of the work to be on, was her use of color and um, a depiction of her emotions. At the time was 1930. She was having those mental health struggles, possibly showing her blues, her sadness, her depression that she was struggling with. But in the center, we have the bright white spike that draws the attention of the viewer. Um, I like to think that this spike kind of represents the little bit of hope that you would have while struggling with the mental health. And um, it naturally draws your attention to it because it's in such contrast to the dark blues and greens elsewhere in the painting. As we know, Jack in the Pulpit has some other interpretations, which is why it's her most contested in regard to the underlying meaning of the work. The main source of the contest is whether the painting is meant to be an expression of feminine sexuality through its form. Clearly, it has an undeniable um, relation to the female sex organs, which is, of course, what leads to the idea that the work was feminist in nature and was more so an expression of her sexuality than a showing of her use of color. At the time, the art piece was condemned by male art critics as being vulgar and inappropriate, and this left O'Keeffe frustrated that her artistic talent was being overshadowed by the notion that the art was sexual in nature. So, some context surrounding feminism in the 1930s. This is the decade after women's suffrage was achieved, and women were more equal socioeconomically to men than ever before. They were um, more independent of their male counterparts, their husbands, their brothers, their fathers. They were exploring socially, going to bars and speakeasies at the time, and they belonged there. They were welcomed there. At this time, the women's suffrage movement, the feminist movement, began to lack in its political influence, and um, it became dormant in the years following that, despite the fact that women were still oppressed, as we can now look back and say for certain that equality was not quite so equal. Specifically, in art in the early 20th century, female artists were a huge part of the advancement and success of American art. Women were present at the Ashcan School. They contributed a lot to bringing Cubism and abstraction to America and making those popular. They were leaders in the Harlem Renaissance, and they played a huge role in the Federal Art Project, which was a government-run office that um, kind of handled the propaganda during the World Wars, um, as many men were off fighting in Europe and in the Pacific. Women were there to fill the role that the Federal Art Project needed. So Georgia O'Keeffe has denied that Jack in the Pulpit #4 is an expression of her sexuality. In fact, we discussed earlier how um, she resented the fact that it was interpreted that way by the public and by the critics. But the real question is whether or not her intent matters. We discussed it in our discussion a couple weeks ago about who really decides what the art means. Um, I made the analogy that kind of helped me understand it is that the artist is like a teacher. They're the ones that know the learning objectives, and they attempt to reach those through their lectures, with the lecture being um, Georgia O'Keeffe's painting here, Jack in the Pulpit #4. We as the audience, the students, are meant to interpret those lectures, and in an ideal world, our interpretation will match the intent of the artist. But here, that wasn't so much the case. Instead, by and large, the painting was received as a feminist work depicting the sexuality of women at the time. So, which one is correct? I don't think that necessarily matters. I think that although the interpretation is wrong, that doesn't make it any less impactful. Uh, to the feminist movement, to female sexuality at the time, the perception of this art um, made a big difference in bringing that to light and leading to more openness in female sexuality. Despite Georgia O'Keeffe's intent, the result does not reflect that. So I believe that although it's not a feminist work, it still had a great impact on feminism at the time.